Financial Report. I'm Dan Eastman, your host, and today is Wednesday, February 4th, 2026. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we appreciate your viewership here at the Eastman Financial Report and throughout the day on all of the great programming you see here on worldviewtube.com and, of course, here at Worldview Radio. As you know, we're a Christian broadcasting network, and it is our mission, our ministry, our goal, and our passion to be able to bring to the great marketplace of ideas on a daily basis all of the news and information from a Christian perspective. That is important, and that's the reason we exist, and that's what we do, and we do very well. If you'd like to help us in that ministry, you can do that by going to worldviewfoundation.com and making a donation. You can sign up for a one-time donation, and of course, we appreciate your generosity and your enthusiasm for our ministry. Or you can sign up for monthly donations, which has the added benefit of flattening our revenue curve and helping us better match costs to revenues, and that keeps us broadcasting free of charge. As you know, you're not paying a subscription fee or a paywall right now. You're watching our broadcasting free of charge, and that's the way the gospel has been delivered for 2,000 years. Think about it, back 2,000 years ago when the apostles were preaching the message in the Middle East, they weren't charging as an admission for some entertainment or some venue. It was a message freely given, and we do that in our ministry today. And you can be a big part of that just by going to www.foundation.com, or you can use the convenient QR code and scan your phone. It'll take you right to the website, and you can help us out. You can also help us by doing business with the vendors you see advertising throughout the day on our network. We don't we don't sell blocks of advertising time. Rather, we partner with companies that we know and trust, and they are very good companies, and when you purchase goods and services from them, a small portion of the proceeds comes back to us in the form of a commission, and that also helps us sustain our ministry. You can also subscribe to our great product called The Vault. If you go to worldviewtube.com/vault, you will be able to subscribe. There's a little paywall there, but you will have access to all of Brandon Howe's ministry. It's a great historical collection. Brandon's been in this space since 2006, and he's written 15 books, and he's had conferences, seminars, and events, and all of that has been recorded, and those recordings are stored inside the vault. So if you are looking for a place to go for some spiritual uplifting, that is a wonderful product to buy and have for yourself. There are days when your spiritual needs are stronger than others, and there are days when you really could use a little bit of an uplift. Being able to tap into the vault, which is on demand 24 hours a day, and watching some great Christian content is really, really a good tool to have in your tool bag. And also think about the people in your lives who are struggling. We all know people who are going through some very difficult times, and the question is, how do I help them? I take them out for coffee, or meet them for lunch, or buy them a good book, or refer them to Scripture, open the Scripture and hear the Word of God. But you can also give them a gift subscription to the vault, because that might just be the thing that helps them change the course of their lives, or at least their spiritual journey. And it's a wonderful gift to give. So you should perhaps subscribe to the Vault yourself to have that in your personal tool bag, but also think about giving the gift of a subscription to the Vault to people who you know are struggling, because it's a really wonderful thing to have. So that's how you can help us out in this ministry, and we do appreciate your constant support. 2026, of course, is shaping up to be a very big, important year politically, economically, fiscally. And we intend to be here very strong, continuing to broadcast in this space, because it is our ministry to bring to that world marketplace of ideas our perspectives from a Christian perspective. That's what we do here. So thank you for your support and help. Well, I'm back from my journey, and of course, my sport coat is not back from my journey, but I am, and back in studio. And I wanted to continue talking about, of course, our beloved federal government. And I start this dialogue or diatribe pointing out that we are still $38.5 trillion in national debt, and we're still in fiscal year 2026 of the federal government. And it is projected, depending on whose projections you read, to be running about $2 to $2.5 trillion in deficit. That means they're going to spend more, $2.5 trillion more than they collect from the taxpayers. So how do they do it? How can you possibly spend $2.5 trillion you don't have? It's simple. You go into the debt markets and you borrow the rest, and that becomes the driver for an ever increasing federal debt level, and of course, more and more burden on our tax base. And keep in mind the American tax base, revenue base. If you Google or search the internet and ask the question to the amazing mind of AI, how much money does the federal government raise in a year? You'll find from all revenue sources it's about $5 trillion, give or take. And of course, that's a lot of money. But of course, Congress spends 7.5 or $7 trillion, leaving every year, year after year, deficit spending because we don't have a balanced federal budget. We have a deficit-driven budget, and that deficit just keeps accumulating into a larger and larger and larger pile of debt. And the interest on that debt is now consuming 25% of the tax revenues. So we have to borrow even more money if we're going to meet all of the spending objectives that come out of the bleeding hearts in Congress who never pass up an opportunity to spend make-believe money on programs, only to find out, as you read in the news, that so much of that federal money and spending is destined for fraud and for misuse and abuse by the people who are allegedly benefiting. They never see the money. It's the people administering who see the money, and that's a real sad thing. And of course, we're watching that. We're watching it in Minnesota. I think the big story we're going to be watching probably next week, by the time this starts to solidify, is the $100 billion in hospice care fraud coming out of Los Angeles. Apparently, there are more hospice facilities in Los Angeles than everywhere else in the United States. And it seems to be an absolute money pit with respect to the conversion of federal dollars. And it just goes to show that for all of the good intentions of Congress, when it's fun to be elected by 166,000 people sent off to Washington and spend money that you don't have, it's not yours, it's not your citizens, it's not your taxpayers. It's just spend whatever you think is prudent and necessary to be good governance in Washington, D.C., and then borrow because you don't have anywhere near the tax base to support the spending. So you borrow the rest and you basically take the American economy and you put it ever more stretched into fiscal tension that will ultimately someday result in major upheavals. And that's unfortunate. We're watching in very slow time the effectively the fundamental transportation or transformation, as former president once said, of the United States into a shabbier and shabbier place, and it's all because of a Congress that simply cannot spend within its means, its tax-based means. So we know the story, but I want to talk about the bill that was signed into law yesterday. And of course, we've been talking about the government shutting down. If you remember, if you go into the vault, the worldview.com/vault, if you subscribe, you have access not only to some amazing spiritual content, but you also have access to the Eastman Financial Report archives. And you will hear me talking in November and December about how the federal government of the United States went out of business, even though they never closed down. You just simply cannot close down a behemoth of that size. But the point was, we went through the symbolic exercise of 43 days where the federal government was shut down, even though it was never shut down. And we listened to that. And of course, the question was the kicking of the can. They don't pass an annual budget like the school board does, or the common council, or your village board, or your state. They don't. They do continuing resolutions and funding resolutions to kick the can down the road. And this is how Washington operates. So there's never a big picture planning or a 5-year plan. It sounds like the old Soviet Union idea of the 5-year plan and the 10-year plan. Well, there is some merit in budgeting, and especially when you're operating organizations, that you have fiscal visibility that perhaps extends beyond 3 months or so, especially when you're running an ongoing operation as large as the federal government of the United States, $7.5 trillion in expenditures. But they don't do that. And of course, that would probably be something that would be appreciated by the American public, the tax-paying public, but it's simply politically not possible. And you think about it, I mean, back in the olden days, if you had, the green eye shade crowd sitting there trying to do a federal budget since World War II on an annual basis, you could see how that would become a complicated and labor-intensive process. As a matter of fact, some states, like the state of Wisconsin, actually, we do budgeting on a biannual basis so that we don't have to do this on an annual basis because there would never be any other time for the legislature to consider other important matters. So we have a budget session. We elect a new legislature in January, and then the first thing they do is they hammer out the 2-year biennial budget. Lots of sausage being made, lots of horse trading, and of course our governor will sign that bill into law. We have a unique, somewhat unique line. We don't have we have the veto power. Our governor has the veto power where you can strike out a word and change the meaning of the sentence, and it's been controversial for many governorships, many decades, but has led to some rather bizarre results. But the point is, we do go through a 2-year exercise of figuring out how much is it going to cost to run Wisconsin, and there's a lot of debate. That's the beauty of democracy, of course. Everybody argues and debates, but then a bill is hammered out and eventually it gets vetoed, partially vetoed and signed by the governor, and it becomes the law. And that's what we live on for 2 years. And then the cycle starts again 18 months later. The federal government needs to really be thinking about that. But up until the time of perhaps AI and all of this exciting, Doge and all of this big data processing, that would have been a very complex process. But when you think about today, if you wanted to do a federal government budget, first you'd have to understand where the money's going. And that's what Doge was all about when that thing came into being. The idea was to take a deep dive into the federal agencies and see where the money actually went. And of course, what you find is the money goes to strange places that nobody ever anticipated, like suitcases destined for Somalia and fraudsters' pockets and Swiss bank accounts. But it very, very seldom hits the pocketbook or the mouth of the needy. And that's why I think with technology, especially with the advent of super technologies like fractal technologies and other types of high process data processing analytics, we could get to a point where the federal budget becomes a digital exercise, and you can bring much more discipline and control to a federal budget, even on an agency basis, if you can analyze dollar in, dollar out, and you can analyze the security as those dollars flow through the system, and then you can do a cost benefit analysis to see how many of those dollars actually hit the intended beneficiary versus the Swiss bank account. And that'd be a big question to ask. But technology is emerging that allows the Treasury Department to do that. And I'm encouraging the U.S. Treasury Department to look very carefully at data processing type technologies, big data technologies that track the dollar from the day you sell the bond, even though you would rather raise the money from the taxpayer because you would tax and spend rather than tax, borrow, and spend, Smith v. Keynes. But the point is, you would be able to track money coming in through the programs, and auditing becomes digital. Now, from the corporate perspective, we all know, I've spent a lot of decades of my life in corporate America. And one thing is that you can't hide money. Real, legitimate, genuine money is digital and it's trackable. And it's always trackable. And that's why ultimately corporate fraud is discovered, because if you know how to look and where to look, and you have modeling and you have statistical sampling, you can almost always detect fraud. Eventually, fraud is detected. At the end of the day, it's not possible to steal money in an audited environment without getting caught someday. Well, with new technologies emerging, that someday becomes much, much sooner. And that's where we need to be moving. So it's not just a matter of playing detective and using technology to find stolen federal revenue, federal dollars, allocated dollars, but the ability to put ring fences and silos around those dollars, and then analyze the actual benefit to do a cost benefit analysis. So we have a program, let's say we're going to provide, pick something obscure. We'll provide sleeping bags for homeless people. Okay, great. There's $250 billion for sleeping bags for homeless people. Check the contracts on that. But the point is, we will now allocate $250 billion to buy sleeping bags for homeless people. And then we will analyze to see how many sleeping bags are bought, at what price, who got them, and whether or not the homeless people actually used the sleeping bags. That would make logical sense, because if you're running a business, that's exactly what you do. If you're going to allocate $250 billion into a new project, you will track the benefit of that. And there was an interesting story today that I wanted to point out, and this has to do with electric vehicles. And it might sound like I'm hopping around a bit, but I'm not. Because the story, the big news story, was $114 billion, $114 billion in write-offs of electric car development from the big automotive manufacturers, because there's no demand for electric vehicles. There's no significant demand. There's novelty demand, but there's no significant consumer demand for electric vehicles, and the big reason is the range. Nobody wants to have to stop and stand in line for an hour or two and then plug your car in for a half hour, and then, maybe the charger's broken and you can't find one, so you're stuck on the side of the road. And you finally get to your destination. Americans don't live like that. We're quick, we're fast. You get in the car and you drive to where you're going. Maybe it's stop for gas, takes you 10 minutes, maybe buy something in the convenience store. We want to move, we want to go. And because of that inherent nature of American transportation, the idea of having a car that you can go 200 miles and then you got to take 2 hours to plug it in and charge it, and if you can find a charger and then continue on your way. I mean, we might as well go back to the horse and buggy days. It would, or take the railroad. The whole railroad network in America collapsed in the early 1900s because automobiles circumvented the problem of it taking so long to get from point A to point B. Automobile transportation and then ultimately air transportation supplanted railroads because of time. People value their time. The hours of your life are valuable. So anyway, the point is, in the private sector, with all these automotive companies, they're all required to do quarterly reporting. And when they do report their results, of course, it has to be accurate under the SEC rules. And these are all publicly traded companies. So there's a great deal of concern and watch and vigilance with respect to the spending of the corporate treasury. If you're going to invest in machines and production lines and labor and engineering, design, all the stuff it takes to build electric cars, then you want to make sure that there's return on that invested capital. And of course, there is not. So what's happening is these auto manufacturers are dialing back, they're cutting production, they're canceling product lines, they're switching production back to internal combustion because the internal mechanisms of their organizations are saying, stop doing this and go back to doing that, or we're going to go broke. So they stop or they move back. And there's a big write-off. It's $114 billion written off in losses, and that happens, and it's happening in real time. Well, the federal government doesn't have that mechanism, So we go back to my, $150 billion, $250 billion for sleeping bags for homeless people. Once the money's allocated, then it's just gone. It's in the system. There's a presumption because it's the federal government that everybody's getting their sleeping bag. It probably cost, $12,000 each. But the point is, there's no mechanism that would ever say in a federal government program, wait a minute, let's stop, let's look, let's reallocate. This isn't working. There's no demand. This isn't what we thought it would be. Let's pull the money back. Let's take it somewhere else. You can't, because all the special interests that got this thing passed, $250 billion for sleeping bags, they're the ones that are making the money. See, it's not the poor homeless person who gets the grossly overpriced sleeping bag. It's all of the infrastructure that survives on the allocation of federal dollars. And there is simply no audit mechanism to ever look at that program and say, wait a minute, this isn't working. And then shift gears. You can take a look at HUD, at Housing and Urban Development from going back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and the Section 8 program and some of the other programs that were designed altruistically to provide housing for Americans, safe, decent, sanitary housing. That was the standard, safe, decent, and sanitary. Well, we are now 2 generations into it, and you can't turn it off. You can't reallocate. It just is. It's funded for eternity. And there's such an industry that's grown up around that platform of government subsidized housing in any form, Section 8, other sections of the Housing and Urban Development Bill. The point is, government spending tends to be eternal. And that's why without a mechanism in place, you can't ever stop the deficit spending. The deficits will continue, the national debt will get bigger, and only maybe because of the advent of artificial intelligence, which keep in mind is artificial, and also perhaps the ability to analyze data at a fractal level rather than in an old linear level, you might be able to bring discipline to a spending program, but then you need the political will to do it. And that is another big problem. Well, I've got to take a break here. I'll be right back and we'll continue these thoughts. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now. And we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
Okay, so I'm back, and I want to finish that thought. And how I started with this today is the president signed this bill into law that opened up the government, and it was apparently closed over the weekend. Never closes, but the point is, the law went into effect, and there's still a massive deficit. And of course, if you're on X and other platforms, there's a lot of fist shaking and anger and angst that this does nothing more than perpetuate the deficit, perpetuate the debt. But when you look at the elements of the bill that was passed, you can see that incrementally President Trump is really starting to dismantle some of the fatal faults and flaws in the federal spending mechanism. It's impressive. Now, this is a big bill. You got to spend, you really have to pass it before you can read it. But there are some real wins in there. And of course, the whole Democrat argument for not, for shutting down the government, even though, Peter and the Wolf, was the idea of funding ICE, because they don't like the federal government going into cities and rounding up illegal aliens and sending them back home. They prefer to have them stay here and vote. But the point is, if you read, and I will be reading the bill, I was traveling yesterday, but I want to go in and start to point out some of the significant changes that are being made to the federal process of taxing, borrowing, and spending. And if we can get to tax and spend, and mind you, we've got a $38.5 trillion hangover, and we're in the middle of a deficit season. In order to close that deficit gap, you'd really have to raise taxes, which is always politically unpopular. So the question is, how do you cut federal spending to bring it in line with the $5 trillion in federal revenues, and keeping in mind that 1.2 trillion of those are already spoken for on interest on the 38.5 trillion of debt. So the point is, President Trump signs this bill, the government's back open, even though it never closed. And the interesting thing to note is that this is a full year funding bill that funds us through September 30th. Now, if you're like me and you look, this is February and March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, and you get about 8 months. There's 12 months in a year, so this was a full year funding. But what that means is that this bill will take us to September 30th, whereupon we shall then have the government closing down again. So they've effectively kicked the can to September 30th, which is fine. Although when you think about it in the midst of an election year, of course, we've got the midterm elections coming up November 7th or 4th. It's the first Tuesday in November. Here we go, just before the election, we're going to have the same fiasco on September 30th. The Democrats will think of some reason not to vote for something. And then, of course, the government will shut down and we'll go into the national election and fists will be shaking. And, it all depends. Last time they were picking on 42 million Americans who were on food stamps. And, of course, the air traffic controllers are always the hot button football. But this is where we are. So we now have legislation just about everything. They're still arguing about the funding of ICE, but effectively, for the most part, the federal government will be funded through September 30th, which is the next kicking of the can. So at least we don't have to worry about this until September 30th, which is always a really good thing. Okay, so let's talk about something else. And I talked about the electric vehicles. I want to follow that story because it's another example of technology. When you get technology has its own curve and lifespan and curve, and you can't drive past technology. And that's something that we see with electric vehicles. I think the world got ahead of itself. In a perfect world, we'd all love to have an electric car. You plug in, you drive. I think the maintenance costs, they probably would be better on the environment, at least emissions and all. But the reality is the technology is not there. Now, the automotive technology is there. The battery technology is not. And until that problem is solved, we're going to end up with massive write-offs. And the question is, why would you invest all of this money to build electric cars only to find out there's no demand for electric electric cars, and there's no demand for electric cars because the batteries can't propel the cars the way the market demands. So why would you do that and then write off $114 billion? And the answer is because sometimes society, from a societal perspective, we get out ahead of ourselves and the media creates the momentum. And if you react as a business, if you react into that momentum, thinking if we don't do electric vehicles, we're going to be left behind, or people will say nasty things about us and they'll stop buying our brand, you jump on that bandwagon to your detriment because this is a lot of money. Now, keep in mind, these are write-offs. That means that you can shelter other income, but it sure doesn't hurt. It sure doesn't help to lose $114 billion in capital, basically. And the whole thing was driven in part by the $7,500 federal subsidy. So if anybody bought an electric car, you get $7,500 in tax credit from the federal government. Well, it's an indirect transfer, but what it does is it helps to increase that annual deficit, which helps to increase our national debt. So the bigger question, and this goes back to our Congress again. Congress thought it'd be a great idea to create a tax subsidy for people who can expend, money on a $50,000 electric car, and they get a tax break. But the poor person buying a very inexpensive entry-level car does not get that same tax break because there's no incentive to buy what the market provides. So it's a problem that this is one of the reasons why we have these massive deficits and this massive national debt. It's this altruistic idea that if you use tax dollars to incentivize people to do something they would not normally do, then they're doing it for the tax reasons. And, maybe it's fun to drive an electric toy around. But that's another example of why we're in such of a federal budgetary problem. This is another perfect example of the ability to go to Washington and think, this is great. Let's have a tax credit for people who buy expensive electric cars, only to find out that the technology isn't there. So the momentum pushes the technology into the marketplace. And lo and behold, the companies that follow suit, because they're very concerned about regulatory aspects and brand damage and this and that, end up holding the bag. At the end of the day, somebody lost $114 billion, and that's what's being written off. It's a lot of money. I mean, you could buy a lot of sleeping bags for that. So, okay, let's also talk about, in my few minutes left here, I wanted to talk about the the situation with the healthcare in the United States. And if you remember back into November, we were talking about the federal government being closed down for 43 days, which it never was, over the issue of the Democrats wanted Congress to continue subsidizing the insurance companies so the insurance companies would be able to capture federal dollars as a portion of the premium that's set by the states. Insurance companies don't set these rates, the states do. It's very important to understand that distinction. So there would be a subsidy to the insurance company, which would keep the premium to the Obamacare purchaser, the insurance purchaser, lower. Their portion of the premium would be lower and more affordable. And of course, that didn't happen. So January 1st comes along, January 2nd, everyone's rates went up. And of course, Adam Smith is a pretty tough person to beat. He had this eureka moment, sort of like Newton. It's a eureka moment that in a marketplace, there's supply of a good and there's a demand for that good. And at the point where the supply equals the demand, that's the equilibrium point. And at that quantity and that price, that's the equilibrium. And of course, in the Obamacare market, which is really not a market at all, these are state-sanctioned insurance policies that can be offered for sale. So people go into what is perceived as a marketplace, and you shop around for an Obamacare policy that meets your needs, but the price is set by the state. You're not negotiating price. You're basically comparing benefits, and you look at the price and the set of benefits, and you pick one, but you're not negotiating directly. You're a price taker. In my particular region, there's 10 policies that were approved for offer to the public by the state of Wisconsin, and that's your choice. You go in, and you have some ability to pick and choose between, but you're not negotiating price. You think, for this price, I get this bundle. For this price, I get that bundle. So it's very indirect. And the problem is, with the subsidies not being as robust as the Democrats had hoped, and the budget marching on, what you realize is supply and demand still works, and the demand for these very expensive policies is declining. So therefore, because it's not illegal, see, when they passed Obamacare, it was illegal if you didn't buy one. You'd end up in jail if you didn't buy insurance. Well, that kind of rubbed the American conscience the wrong way, and the courts didn't really. So the point is, it's no longer illegal if you don't buy one. You just don't have insurance, so you could be wiped out if you get chronically or horribly ill. So the point is, people are not buying the policies because it's too much money, and therefore the demand is declining and the supply is fixed because the supply was fixed by the state. So therefore, what's happening is that the revenue flowing in to support these insurance policies is not forthcoming because there are fewer people buying them. And insurance is a pool. You get 100 people and they all throw some money in, and if somebody's injured or hurt, well, that pool of money goes to help the poor soul that was injured. That's how insurance works. We all pay for car insurance, and most of us don't have accidents in any one year. And the people that do, then they get the compensation. That's how insurance works. Well, the free market pressures are very much alive in the Obamacare market in that there are fewer people demanding and paying premiums. So therefore, the risk profiles aren't in line with the projections, and therefore the insurance companies are losing money. So guess what? They're not going to be offering the same type of policy next year because they lost money this year. And that, of course, those numbers will be approved by the state again. And that marketplace, I project, will have fewer offerings, fewer supply offerings. And depending on the pricing, depending on what happens between now and the end of the year, we'll see where the demand falls. So this is how you can watch in real time as a market through market forces. Adam Smith, classical economic market forces, starts to deteriorate before your very eyes. Well, anyway, I'm out of time for today. I'm glad to be back in the great metropolis of Milwaukee. Please go to Worldview Foundation and make a donation to keep us alive and robust. And we appreciate your viewership. So have a great afternoon. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.